It has sometimes been said that everybody wants to be loved. And a video I watched recently by someone named Sean Stephenson, who was once a PhD holding psychologist in a wheelchair with no legs, and only lived to the age of about 40, said that everybody wants to feel loved, even by those in prison. And this lecture that I was viewing by him, which was entitled "The Prison of Your Mind," talked of this. And he said that under the right conditions, even the prisoners there would admit they wanted to be loved. And I'm reminded too of how Johnny Cash was so well received at Folsom Prison, giving concerts there, because prisoners there, even quote-unquote murderers, felt loved by him in the sense that he understood where they were coming from, how they had ended up in this situation that resulted in their taking the life of someone else. But why do we want to feel loved? And what does that mean, to feel loved, anyway? I'm reminded of a phrase that someone has the face or the body that only a mother could love. Well, would that be enough if we knew just one person loved us, or a few? So what are we talking about here, I wonder? When we say we want to feel loved, does that mean, I think, that we want to feel at least there's some few people out there, as exemplified, say, by some or more mothers, that could love us, despite our flaws, that many people in many cultures or environments might deem us to be unlovable? Again, why would we think that it's such a horrible thing not to be lovable by anybody? I believe it's because mankind has a strong aversion to being alone for appreciable lengths of time. And there's a philosopher by the name of Albert Camus, C-A-M-U-S, who once talked of the pains so many feel about being alone in a room with their thoughts. I think this too is why even those who practice meditation often wish to use meditation music or a mantra, and that they're also urged to push out any thoughts that come to mind and to practice no-mindedness, because otherwise thoughts that would enter their mind while meditating would be very disturbing. And part of the so-called regenerative effect then, in my opinion, of meditation done to push out thoughts and avoid them is to simply have a period of time of low impact in terms of anger and fear. It's regenerative and caused by no thinking, so to speak, because the cognitive behavioral therapists today in America, for instance, say that our emotions are caused by our thoughts. Oftentimes, I would say, because of words we use that have toxic emotions built into them every time we think the word. And so, to stop thinking for a period of time, it's sort of like sleeping, because then you don't have a whole lot of emotions coming to the consciousness that are disturbing. I'm reminded too of how 15 years ago I used to try to meditate some and was urged, or rather, I found it impossible to do for more than 3 or 4 minutes of a time because painful thoughts would come to the surface while I was not using meditative music or mantras, and I had to stop the meditating. Additionally, 40 years ago, I was told by a psychoanalyst that meditation was a form of zoning out, shall we say, and thus was not getting to the root of issues. It was simply escaping them by not thinking, basically, by avoiding the issues. And that while it felt good in the short run, it wasn't doing any good in the long run. Thus, that it was more a form of escapism in general, or going into a trance, basically. I also think of how prisoners put in solitary confinement in our prisons today, especially in America, find it extremely difficult usually to handle. Even with their generally being given TV sets and 1 hour a day outside of their cell for exercise, done alone. They're typically being the rather distasteful, to our mind, use of excrement smeared on the walls in an excruciating attempt to cope. Indeed, some of them attempt suicide, but that's rather difficult without any means, basically. And probably most of them are receiving prescriptions or medications, shall you say, to dull down their fear levels in general, their emotions in general. But even with the TV sets going 24/7, that's not sufficient enough. And some people today have been pushing to outlaw solitary confinement because they say it's cruel and inhumane. Because the prisoners basically, I would say, are being forced to live in a room alone with their thoughts, and they can't handle it. Just like I couldn't even handle meditation for 5 minutes 15 years ago. And they probably have, on average, far fewer intellectual capacities than I had to process their thinking regarding the fears they have that come to the surface. I'm aware, too, that the so-called wealthy of a society, especially like ours, may have more of their safety needs and physiological needs met than others in the societies, but that their number one complaint tends to be boredom, and boredom in turn caused by familiarity in what they can afford to get, for distractors basically, and pleasure sources too, in general. And with boredom comes the tie-in to no longer finding things to do that distract us from our thoughts that trouble us. And my own opinion, too, is that loneliness is in large part a lack of distractors. So this comes then to the crux, I believe, that we all want to feel loved, but we all want thus to feel lovable by somebody. And if we never had that experience in childhood, that somebody loved us, then I suppose it would be much harder later on to feel loved by anybody. Because a mother probably would be the only most likely source to love their child, due to, amongst other things, the amount of investiture they had in bringing the child into being. 9 months worth of pregnancy, basically, along with the child being very dependent on the mother afterward, of course. I'm reminded, too, of phrases like mama's boy, and how up to a certain point in time, in Italy, for instance, it was not uncommon for young males to be living with their parents or mothers, up to like 30 years of age or so. There's also a physician in Canada who's done much work with trauma, Gabor Mate, M-A-T-E, and he's also done many decades of work with the very poor, drug-addicted, and HIV-positive people in the Skid Rows of Vancouver, Canada. And he said a defining issue in whether someone was going to grow out of their situation was whether anyone had ever loved them before. I would say, namely, in their childhood. And again, I would extend this to mean that if you had never experienced that before by somebody, usually in childhood, then it would be very difficult for you to feel it could ever happen. There's also a real estate individual, John Asseroff, quite wealthy now financially, who once was in quite a bit of trouble as a child with crime and so on. And at one point in time, I believe around the age of 20, a video says that he met someone by accident who changed his whole life around. He says what happened is that this one person out of anyone he had ever met before showed him extraordinary kindness. And by kindness, my interpretation would be love, but moreover, to clarify that as acceptance. And what do I mean by acceptance? First, I would say acceptance that the flaws a person has were not basically chosen, but put upon them, their destiny by the laws of nature, that there's a cause and effect for everything. And thus, the person is not really morally culpable or blameworthy for these, despite what many people might like to say as to how they should take responsibility, or quit being lazy, or pull themselves up by their bootstraps, when in fact, for a variety of reasons, that might be very difficult. And any so-called paid help available might not be able to do the job for a variety of reasons. And even rehab centers oftentimes or typically taking people with chemical-based addictions and in 30 days or so turning them back out with a new form or set of addictions, let's say to buprenorphine or other drugs that substitute. There's the use, of course, of methadone, say. Secondly, I think many of us would like at least some people to know in general just how hard it is to, quote, kick the habit, to change something about ourselves that may trouble quite a few people and be very distasteful to a number of people. Typically, for a couple reasons, I believe. Either there's no good help available, or the help that is available is not authorized by law to provide help, such that they would be called practitioners offering medicine without a license, and thus subject to punishment by law. Or their environments might be so stressful, and this typically not very easy to change, especially in a country, particularly industrialized ones, where the cost of housing that is decent is quite high. So, to revisit the idea again, I think when we say we all would like to be loved or feel lovable, I believe that means at least by somebody. Because if we were once loved by somebody, we figure that if we don't have that right now, maybe we will again in the future, because if it happened before, it could happen again if we look hard enough for it. But again, I think a mother is most predisposed on average to love their child no matter what, to include even any birth defects, deformities in general, not just matters of personality issues that might be disagreeable. For instance, if a child has colic as a baby, a mother would be most likely to tolerate this far better than if the child were out in public and the public were asked to tolerate the child's anger, shall we say, fear-based screaming. The mother, too, would be more predisposed to know why the child would be angry, whether it were colic or who knows what. Indeed, there have been cases where a mother even gave up her own life to save her child. But I think after the age of 18 or so, the mother might be less predisposed to do that. And the public in general would be far less predisposed to give up their life for anybody else other than a family member. They just wouldn't see the point in it. Now, in books, literature, etc., I've read over the years, it has been pointed out that some people find solitary quite helpful to them in terms of growth. But yet others have said that this can be quite difficult to engage in at first and get used to. For instance, Bob Wells, the leader of a movement to help people cope with ways of life other than the typical rat race approach, and thus his book, How to Live in a Car, Van, or RV, I believe, and leading a yearly get-together in Quartzsite, Arizona, on how to be a nomad. He says it's quite difficult for most people in general to start off breaking from the urban way of life and the money-based way of life, the chaotic approach to life. But he says in time you can get used to it and benefit enormously. I'm reminded too, I believe it was Paul Bunyan spent time in prison for his religious beliefs and found it quite beneficial. Indeed, some writers have found it quite beneficial to be in prison. One person even said that when they were falsely imprisoned as a Buddhist, that they found it to be a vacation because they had more time to study. But from what I've seen too, a defining issue is whether this solitary situation has been chosen or forced upon a person. And maybe the underlying issue, as it comes to me now, is that if it isn't chosen, it's probably because a person couldn't even conceivably be at a point in their lives where they could cope with such. And that goes for becoming a so-called nomad, taking up the RV way of life, say. that one doesn't do this all in one fell swoop, but through baby steps typically, and only if one so-called volunteers to do it of one's own accord, because one is ready to either take the baby steps or go full in. And if forced to do so, this probably happens before they are ready. Ready in terms of the amount of distractions they need in life, the amount of status they need, the amount of control, and so on. I'm reminded of once being told 15 years ago that part of the reason I could not find somebody to marry was because I didn't have enough money to offer to someone for security. And unfortunately, that person did not tell me that depends a whole lot on where you live and in what country. For instance, people in urban land wanting a whole lot more money for a variety of reasons, part of it for security, than in the rural areas of America. And that this, of course, is much different in some other countries in general. But then here comes a bigger issue that has been coming to my mind lately. And it's the issue of the notion and idea behind the word toxic. I bought a book, for instance, 5 or 10 years ago about toxic people or toxic coworkers, and I didn't read it ever, but the concept stuck in my mind and has been brought up on YouTube videos by some psychologists even, that there is so-called toxic traits, toxic behaviors, and toxic people. In fact, there are some psychologists today in America who talk a lot about narcissism and bill themselves as experts on narcissism and how to beat narcissistic abuse if you have been narcissistically abused. And one of their key points is how to spot a narcissist, they say, and run for the hills, basically. How never again to fall victim, they say, to what once happened to you before. But my opinion and view on all of this is that these so-called experts in this area of toxic traits, toxic people as they call it, narcissists as they call it, is that they too find it very difficult to cope with a narcissist as they call it. And these people giving the advice on so-called toxic traits like narcissism as they call it, I believe were quite hurt in one way and fled for the hills themselves and made a career out of it, a subspecialty in telling others how to flee too. And what they do not seem to have the capacity to do is tolerate certain traits in people, namely to tolerate injuries to their self-esteem, either to tolerate someone telling them flaws they have that they don't want to hear they have, often because they're hard to correct, or secondly because someone tells them they have a flaw that they don't have but they buy into and claim that they do have it. Lee Carter, for instance, PhD, having written a book on this whole concept of how some of his clients all too easily buy into the concept of falsely being blame shifted onto. So I believe it can work both ways. We sometimes are susceptible to taking on blame that we don't deserve, and secondly, then feeling shame or guilt over it. But also, I believe many of us, including many of these so-called experts on narcissism, cannot handle criticism. And I've thought too a lot about rejection. And I believe a lot of rejection has to do with the incapacity, more and more these days, to tolerate what we used to be able to tolerate. I believe it started in part I would jokingly say, with the introduction of plumbing, water piped into our homes, and toiletry facilities in general in our homes. I watched a video, for instance, a month ago about a young woman in her 20s living in Alaska. And she was talking about how when she had to go from her abode, a little building, to the outhouse, sometimes her hair would freeze, if wet, on the way from or to the outhouse before coming back to her abode, which was warmer. And of course, we have probably heard stories of the mountain men, so to speak, in, say the Rockies in the 1800s, who would trap beaver. They too would have to tolerate a lot of discomfort in terms of their environment, the temperature extremes, the rain, and so on. Of course, not to mention no restaurants, cafes, movie theaters, and malls. And there are other examples. Sometimes there are movies, perhaps put out by the Hallmark Channel, talking about how rough it was, so to speak, in the Wild Wild West. Not just from the elements, of course, but even from so-called non-law-abiding citizens who found it rather expedient to do what they would with their guns and general pushing as they would. But with the introduction then of indoor plumbing and modern day appliances, central air conditioning, we tend to forget, by the way, we didn't have air conditioning on this planet or in America our whole lives, and to include the South and South America for that matter. Indeed, today, in some regions of South America, people sleep in the fields at night. And it would be considered, I suppose, a luxury to even have a refrigerator box to sleep in then. And of course, we have the modern day helpers, shall we say, of cell phones too. Let's say if you had a flat tire, or your car in general broke down, or you had a car accident. We probably would think quite a bit differently if our phones were suddenly taken from us, or the battery went dead and we had a situation on hand with our car. Additionally, there's been jokes from time to time of how Americans are indolent or sloths, to the extent, humorously speaking, of not wanting to walk from one store to another in a strip mall, but that they would rather get in their car and drive 50 feet to get to the next store in that strip mall. And a man, Sam, of the inspirational Nomad channel on YouTube, has talked once of how he has observed a lot watching people in parking lots. And amongst the things he said is he has seen how people love to park very close to the store they're going to go into. Some would call that laziness, but in a sense you could say a greater and greater desire not to be discomforted. I know too, some of the longest living people today on the planet are farmers, say in the far eastern Asian areas. And that it has been said euphemistically that hard work never hurt anybody. You might say in a sense that this hard work also entailed discomfort that was tolerated. I know too, my grandparents, who spent some time raising me, had a farm, and my grandmother, for instance, had never driven a car to the day she died and left the farm once a week. or twice at most, either to get groceries or go to church. Some would say that's very discomforting. And she and her husband, by the way, rarely went to restaurants, and a movie was probably once every 5 or 10 years. And cafes, I don't know that they ever even heard of such a thing, basically speaking, as to how they lived their lives. Some would find this so discomforting. My grandmother, by the way, worked on her farm in the fields at least 8 hours a day and did canning. She got up early and went to bed about 11 p.m. at night. And her recreation was to put her feet in a tub with water and soak them at 10 or 11 at night and watch 1 hour of a soap opera every day on TV. I suppose 1950s onward, when there was TV. And to her dying day, her only TV was black and white. I believe even into the 1980s. This grandmother of mine made her own wine, but she had no more than 1 small glass of it a day. And I suppose her greatest recreation other than that, in terms of imbibing of something, was a cup of coffee she made each day, too. Now, if we're not talking about a strong distaste for physical discomfort from the elements, or a certain lack of a colossal number of distractors, what might be so discomforting to people, especially these days? A couple things come to my mind. First of all, that more and more of us tend to find it more and more discomforting to experience what we call violence. Physical violence, that is. Either of a short-term nature or being chronically injured or maimed, shall we say, to some extent. There also being not just the aspect of the pain involved, but feelings of shame that contribute tenfold, I believe, to the pain involved. So that's a separate issue that I don't believe gets adequately discussed. And then secondly, there being the issue more and more of how oversensitive, you might say, we are more and more these days. Call it to narcissistic wounding, if you will, or assaults to our self-esteem, thus. That if someone calls us a name, it hurts a lot. The phrase, for instance, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, I don't believe plays through very well today, these days. The words, in fact, we fear just as much as the sticks and stones. A self-esteem injury can be very painful, especially if a person can't get to the bottom of it and figure out what's going on. Hence today, more and more on college campuses, we find, I believe, there being a discussion of what is okay to say and what is not, and whether we have the right to say certain things because others might feel hurt. And then the question on my mind being, have we become more and more oversensitive to what people might say about us to the point we're going to legislate more and more what can be said about us, or provide certain safe zones, so to speak, otherwise, for those who are, again, more oversensitive, as I call it, to being told things that injure their self-esteem. You might say, in a sense, a narcissistic wound tied to a greater and greater perception in people these days, especially in America, that they're number one, that they're all Hollywood stars of some sort, and anyone who says anything differently coming as a crushing blow to their esteem, their ego, so to speak, for lack of a better word. If we all think more and more that we're Hollywood stars, or as some would call it, narcissists, then I suppose what anyone says about us, short of claiming we're perfect, can hurt quite a bit, especially if we all the more base our self-esteem on superficial things, and someone says a comment that points out something other than a more substantial basis for our self-esteem, like empathy towards others and backing it up with action, courageously. Of course, it doesn't help, I think, that our legal system has built in the facilitation of easily getting a backing by a lawyer to fight for our cause on a pro bono nature or basis, and such that some of the cases brought up are quite fallacious, perhaps, and based on injuries to our ego, more than any other kind of injury, in fact. But at any rate, at one point in time, far more tolerable. I think, too, in part, our greater and greater inability to tolerate traits of others in certain aspects, to include claims by others that we're not perfect in some way, shape, or form, has a lot to do with our shift more and more towards objects and data rather than people, such that we become less and less able to understand other people and ourselves. And we're shifting more and more from developing the capacity to tolerate others and their traits and grow personally to, again, objects and data and careers, work that deals with such. There was once, for instance, a term in the psychiatric manuals of schizoid disorder, and it talks a whole lot of how these types of individuals, it claims, cannot relate well to others, and they love to spend time alone, a lot of it, and or with computers and objects, data, once again, and I would say perhaps in careers that orient toward that too. But I think in the past 10 years I've never in society heard that word schizoid used, nor online in general, in articles, say, or YouTube videos on topics of so-called mental health issues. Never have I seen the word schizoid. And yet, there have been books that tried to deal with this, like Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, I believe. And I read not that long back that in France the bistros, or shall we say lunch cafes, are starting to die out big time. Why? Because people are more and more brown bagging it during lunch in their own offices. I would say not just because they have a feeling of a time crunch, but because our world more and more is, again, turning more and more to objects and data, not people. Not to mention less and less attendance at church and community events. Now, I know, too, there was a psychoanalyst, Otto Kernberg, once from Europe, then having moved to Chile in South America, and then finally America, New York City. And he claimed 30 years ago, in a document I read, that in his opinion, America was the most paranoid nation on the planet, or rather that he had ever seen, the peoples thereof. And in general, I suppose you would say that he found such persons to be the most intolerant of discomfort, basically, and thus the most prone to catastrophizing what people in the past would have tolerated much more easily. I know, too, for instance, that the President Abraham Lincoln from the 1860s had considerable difficulties at times with depression, if you will. Even on suicide watch once. And yet, he was president. And this was rather tolerated as simply a way of life for a lot of people. One person I know close to me having said that their definition of depression is simply being bummed out. But others having been talking about how more and more problems we have are being medicalized. Thomas Zaz, S-Z-A-S-Z, has written a book on this. I think it might be by the title of The Medicalization of Everyday Life. And I know, too, the writer and show host, Garrison Keillor of A Prairie Home Companion, once said a few years ago in a video that he is disconcerted that more and more aspects of our lives are becoming medicalized in terms of being called quote-unquote mental illnesses talked about in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I see this all as a general pattern of our tolerating discomfort less and less and calling it more and more diseases, and then drugging such persons into more conformity, more zoned out conditions that we find more tolerable. And that our society is more and more terming such people either mentally ill if they have a little quirk, so to speak, that we once used to tolerate and not give a second thought to. I facetiously talk at times of how we can't live without air conditioning, and that if it goes on the blink or our temperature drops 1 degree below what we find most tolerable, that we're ready to call out the National Guard, or if happening on a nationwide basis, it might be the source of a civil war or nuclear war, if we're going to blame it on another country. Whereas once again, before perhaps the 1950s, air conditioning didn't even exist, even in the South of America, let alone South America. There's also the issue, of course, of how parents today often are quite concerned about their children's safety. Some call this helicopter parenting. Parents are also known today to want to micromanage the time of a child, to have everything scheduled, including summers, that the child has to be in a camp every minute, a camp for this, a camp for that, a chess camp, a cheerleader camp, a basketball camp, who knows what kind of camps. And that a number of parents today claim that life is rather dangerous, when in fact studies of some sort have shown things are safer than ever before. But I would say our perception, our degree of capacity to tolerate discomfort, including the unpredictable happening, has gone down, down, down. And our craving to call what we want optimal more and more a right, backed up by pursuit of litigation, often even with the use of pro bono lawyers that don't cost us a thing if we lose the case, but which fuel a flurry of lawsuits and accompanying generation of more and more regulations and laws each year, such that you can't even go to a park these days that is run by a government organization or government in general without knowing whether you're violating one or more of the regulatory laws, hence causing a bit of consternation. I would wrap this up by bringing an examination to bear on how this could have even happened, this increasing level of non-toleration of discomfort, beyond, of course, the fact that technology has brought many comforts that didn't exist before, starting again with indoor plumbing and onward, say with manipulation of our indoor environment temperatures and the automobile especially. And of course, issues of increased efficiency in transportation and speed of it, such that we have very quick delivery of Amazon packages, say, and telephone conversations being cheaper and cheaper today than ever before, especially 20, 30, 40 years ago. I think, for instance, of how abortion became legal in the 1960s. Thus, in essence, a sort of convenience coming in to encourage more and more craving for comfort. Even, as you might say, pursuit of our whims instead of having to tolerate things by way of constraints more in place. There being more and more welfare given, too, in general. And the pill having come in the 1960s. And Thorazine, the first, I say, knockout drug that can really zone you out, called an antipsychotic. And its use all the more later and later, especially with the second generation type of these that have fewer long-term side effects to the brain. And then, too, has been the destigmatization, for better or worse, on divorce. And more and more people living together outside of marriage, for better or for worse, which makes a quickie divorce, if you will, a quickie separation, all the more easy. Then, too, children are more and more disposable after birth by way of more and more easily being drugged into a quiet mode of living, so to speak. In my opinion, all too easily being told and blamed as being brain broken, mentally ill with certain diagnoses applied. Indeed, in a way, I think one can even abort one's child after birth all too easily by doing any number of things that might get one in trouble with child protective services or the law in general, upon which they take the child and put the child in a foster care situation, perhaps, or some kind of home, institution. And the mother sometimes unconsciously, I believe, or even consciously, calculatingly even, doing whatever it takes such that Child Protective Services takes their child and basically aborts it for them, legally and socially acceptably, if you will, such that they no longer have to take care of the child. They may never have wanted a child or have had the empathy to handle relationships with anyone in general, even their own children, and so they have found a convenient way by law now of having more and more comfort in their lives. The trade-off these days may even be simply 2 weeks in prison and a stigma of sorts afterward. Less and less injurious these days with all the welfare afforded and the zone-out drugs available, cheap too, with excuses that you're taking them because you supposedly have a mental disorder. And so, in general, I see our lives as becoming more and more comfort-oriented. And what does that mean for relationships then? What do we find most toxic, so to speak, more and more discomforting? Again, issues of physical aggression, even loud words, anger at times. We might want to call it outbursts, say. Issues of what we call impulsiveness that we possibly in the past would have called a free spirit. Today, the opposite, that we value being zoned out and totally predictable and emotionless and sexless, you might say, too. Indeed, we might call some people today who have emotions above that of the zoned out person histrionic or unstable or irritable. We might also call them bipolar when in fact there's no mention really of any kind of term applied to people who are zoned out and emotionless. There was once the term that someone doesn't have emotions that are labile, L-A-B-I-L-E, but I haven't heard that word for a long, long time. Today, in fact, many males in America never smile. And this does not get any notice whatsoever, nor is there any term assigned to it as supposedly a disorder. It's assumed the norm. These sort of the look of a Marine, so to speak, with a little bit less edge to it in the civilian population. And if we're not, of course, talking about this physical aspect, so to speak, that I believe we've become more and more oversensitive to, less tolerant to, we again, I believe, are getting more and more sensitive to insults to us, so to speak, as we call it. Basically tied, I believe, to being told more and more that we're either not perfect or that the substance of which we base our self-esteem is rather flimsy, shall we say, and we don't want to hear that. There being a considerable substance to that argument, I believe, and it being quite discomforting. Discomforting in general to hear that the claim, for instance, that we are really quite valuable to others has little more substance to it than window dressing, as compared to the old-time values, so to speak, of what they talked about as love. One last note, Alain de Botton, B-O-T-T-O-N, I believe, of the School of Life in England, put out a video, a short 5-minute video on what is love, and in part he talks considerably of how love involves a lot of tolerance of, I don't know what the word was, quirks or inconsistencies, and this is very much what I'm talking about, and I resonated quite a bit with his talk on that. So a short recap, I would say, very short, is that I believe, yes, we would all like to feel loved, but by at least one person, so that we think it could happen again if we don't have that right now. And this being so important to most people, because to not be loved by anyone or have the hope of it is to essentially be all alone in a room with one's thoughts. And while this can be compensated for in the short run by a bunch of purchases or vacation packages, that this gets boring in the long run and quite expensive too for many. Out of the reach in the long run, in fact, encouraging long-term debts and bankruptcy and divorces, noting that financial problems, it's said, is the number one cause for marital strife and divorce. Hence, for most of us, it being very disconcerting, I think, to reach a point perhaps of despair and think we're broken, that we're unlovable by all people, when in fact we haven't even met all people. Most of us haven't probably even left the country to see who might be more predisposed to love us for our flaws than those in America who are quite, shall we say, comfort hounds or couch potatoes, euphemistically speaking. If all we meet are fellow couch potatoes, so to speak, and experts at using the remote control and channel surfing, then how would we even know if we're unlovable to everyone on the planet, that is? That's something I would argue too. Of course, the flip side I would add at the very end here is that it doesn't help matters any that there is so little encouragement to develop ourselves to be more lovable to an increasing sphere of people in a community or country in general. because there are so many other ways of living life. Without people, we can have it basically delivered to our door. We can order everything. We can even have home health care services come to us if we have the money. We don't have to have a relationship basis. We simply buy the help. So this then is why I think it is said we all want to be loved. But to clarify, at least by somebody, and at least at some point in our life, namely especially in childhood, to have experienced that from somebody. It is said, of course, finally, no man is an island. That phrase comes to me, for instance, from a movie about a boy with Hugh Grant. No man is an island, and in that movie it was said he was coming more and more to that conclusion from an experience of helping a young boy.